So this week I am back to painting birds and I decided on painting this goldfinch. I found a beautiful reference photo on Pixabay. Here it is. I'm starting as usual with a quick sketch and I've got my colours laid out on the right there. I've tried to show my palette in some of the painting this time. I do zoom in on the face later on so you won't see it all the way through, but just to try and show you the colours being mixed as well. I'm using a few more colours than I normally would do for this because I wanted to test out some new Daniel Smith watercolours, so I am using more than I really needed to. I'll list all the colours that I use in the description box below. The three main ones are French Ultramarine, Quinacridone Rose and Yellow Ochre, which is actually, the Yellow Ochre is a Windsor and Newton. But those are my three primaries, and then I added in others in different areas. So to start, I've wet a few areas of the goldfinch where this buff yellow gold colour is, and the yellow that I'm using is yellow ochre. I'm toning it down a touch with some red and some blue so it's not quite as bright yellow as it was, and then I'm just dropping that into the wet areas and letting that spread out wet in wet. I'm working in layers with this yellow colour and I'm adding in a darker layer each time I go over the top of it. So I'm just adding some more yellow ochre, some more red and some more blue to the shadows every time I want it to be darker. And in the areas I want it to be a little bit more purple, I'll add some more blue in there. In the brown areas we'll have some more red and some yellow ochre, but just mixing up different ratios of it so it's a bit more varied and it's not the same colour all the way through. For most of this part, all I'm doing is adding thicker layer of paint on top of what I've already painted. I use some clean water just to soften the edges a little bit so you don't get those harsh lines, and occasionally I'll lift out some paint as well with my brush just to preserve some highlights. While I wait for those areas to dry, I'm moving on to the legs. I'm adding in some red to that colour that I've been using just to make it a little bit more purpley, a bit more pink for the legs, and then I'm going to add that on there and create some darker areas with some Dyck Brown. The reason I'm showing my palette or plate as it is, is just so you can see I'm making up the colours by using the paint that's already on there rather than creating fresh colour every single time, and that way it's going to tie everything together. It's also a bit more difficult to say exactly what the colour is because they all kind of run together and merge together, but you should be able to see here the kind of colour that I'm going for. The darker area here has got a lot of Dyck Brown and some of that Quinacridone Rose in there, just so it's got a bit more of a red tone rather than just brown. And a really similar process for the second foot. This area of the bird is predominantly white, but I'm mixing in some shadow colours using blue and red. I make them a little bit thicker and a bit darker each time I add an extra layer until the final layer has a little bit of yellow ochre in as well, so it's a bit more grey than that purple colour we start with. I wanted to darken some of the feathers up of the bird, so I wet some of the areas that I wanted to drop that dark colour in, and then I used the Dyck Brown and the red mixture from before just to pop in a little bit of colour in those areas and let it spread out rather than painting individual feathers, so it's got a nice soft blended edge to it. I'm working my way around the goldfinch, just doing a bit at a time rather than trying to do the whole thing wet in wet, just so it's a bit more manageable. So now I'm working on the tail feathers underneath. I'm trying not to work next to anything that is really wet, just so the colours don't blend and bleed together where I don't want them to. And I'm using similar colours as before, shadow tones here, a bit more yellow ochre, so it's got a slight green tinge to it with that mixed in with the blue, and then some more Dyck Brown for some of the darker areas as well. For the black feathers, I'm mixing some French Ultramarine and some Van Dyck Brown for that really dark mixture. There's some water mixed in with this as well, so that I'll put in the first layer and it'll be a little bit lighter. When I go over it again, I'm going to make the mixture even thicker, so we've got some really dark feathers in there as well. I'm adding some blue to the white feathers just for some shadow detail, and then I'm going to use the Van Dyck Brown mixture just to darken up the tail feathers and add some shadow towards the top. I'm using Hansa Yellow Light and then a little bit of new Gamboge for the yellow stripe along the wing here, but you can use whatever yellow you have to hand. Lemon yellow would work and cadmium yellow as well, so it doesn't have to be the exact same colours used here. I'm going over the dark areas again just to really make them pop and stand out against the lighter feathers. All I'm doing here is using a watered down mixture of some of the paint left on the palette just to knock back the white of the feathers on the left a little bit so they don't stand out too much and they blend in a little bit more with the background. Moving on to the branch, I'm using clean water just to cover the whole area, and then I'm going to drop colours into that. I start out with more of a purpley blue mixture to begin with for some of the lighter areas, and then I use Van Dyck Brown and Quinacridone Rose for some of the brown, and I make it even darker for the final touches. I add some more blue into the mixture and some Van Dyck Brown and red just to make it a really dark brown, and then I use my rigger brush to add in these details. It doesn't carry as much water, so when you put the paint down it doesn't just spread everywhere, and I only want to use this to outline a few edges. I don't need it to cover the whole branch. So for the face, I'm using really similar colours to what I used on the rest of the bird. The three main primaries are still Yellow Ochre, French Ultramarine and Quinacridone Rose, and that's what I'm adding onto the beak here, is a really watered down mixture of those, more on the red side. And then for the darker areas I'll use the rigger brush, and it's slightly more blue-grey for the tips of the bill, making it darker so it stands out. For the face, it's predominantly red, so I'm using Quinacridone Rose here. I'm also mixing in some new Gamboge, so it's more on the orange side, with a tiny little bit of Dyck Brown as well, just to darken it up. First of all, I'm wetting the area so I can put all this in wet. The paint actually did end up bleeding out a little bit from the edges here, so you might just want to watch that as you're painting. I'm adding layers again onto the face, so the next one has a little bit more Quinacridone Rose in it, so it's a bit more red, and then I'll add in some more Dyck Brown for the area around the eye, eventually ending up with a colour that's almost black, so more Dyck Brown and French Ultramarine to go right around the eye and towards the beak for those really dark areas. I use a smaller brush anytime I don't want the colour to bleed too much, so around the beak where it's a bit more delicate, I'm using the rigger brush here to add those darker colours. For the black feathers, I'm adding water to the area first. I'm moving that water outside the area that I want to be black, just to give the paint some room to move into. I'm going to start out with a slightly watered down black, so French Ultramarine and Dyck Brown for this, more on the blue side. And then once I've added that in, I'll go in with a thicker mixture of the black just to sit on top of that, so that you've got this nice diffused edge to it. I'm tidying up a few edges here as I go along, so the red kind of spread a little bit further than I wanted to. To do this, I'm using some clean water just to brush over the area, and then I'm using a paper towel just to lift up any excess paint. I will go over this again just to neaten up the edges eventually. For the eye, I'm using some French Ultramarine for the blue along the top of the eye, and then I'm using some of the dark Dyck Brown French Ultramarine mixture for the darker areas at the bottom, and just to outline it. I'm using a really tiny brush for this just because the painting is so small. I'm adding in another layer of that reddy brown now, just to make the colour a bit more vibrant on the face and to amend some of the areas that I cleared before. I'm on to finishing touches here, and I just wanted to darken some of the areas that were in shadow. So I'm wetting the areas that I want to darken up, and then I'm adding in that Dyck Brown red mixture that I've made, which is a bit of all sorts of colours I think now. It's got the brown, the red, blue in there, and I'm just dropping that in so that it's making the shadows stand out a little bit more. And now for some white gouache highlights. I'm adding in a little bit around the feathers around the face. I'm trying not to overdo this so that it doesn't stand out too much, because I like to try and leave the white of the page. And then I'm also going to put in a couple of highlights along the beak edge and then in the eye just to help it stand out a little bit. And then I think we'll be pretty much done. So that about wraps things up for this little goldfinch. I just need to sign it, remove the masking tape, and I'm pretty much done. This is actually the second time I've painted this bird. I did paint the goldfinch for last week's tutorial, and then after filming it and editing it and doing the voiceover, I deleted it before I had a chance to upload it. So this is the second time I have done this. I'm quite happy with it. It does look different from the first time around. I'll see if I can find that photo just to put in here so you can compare them. And it is nice doing things a couple of times because it does turn out differently every time with watercolour, I've found. But I'm quite happy with this one. I'm happy that I gave it a go again. So here is the finished result. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe if you have, and I will see you all again next Wednesday. Thank you.